Thank you all for coming today. We are very, very honored with the presence of His Excellency, the Ambassador of France to the US, Gérard Araud. He came to Charlotte. This is not the first visit, apparently, and we do hope it's not going to be the last visit. You have an open invitation, Your Excellency, to come to Charlotte anytime when your schedule permits. Thank you for being here. Let's give it a warm Charlotte welcome to Ambassador Gérard Araud. Now, you all know, today, the tragic events in Brussels. It only underscores even more the mission and task that the World Affairs Council has, and all of us, to learn more about the world, to know more about the world, and to promote understanding around the world. Our thoughts are today with the people of Brussels, the people of Belgium, with the victims and their families. It is a tragedy, it is uncalled for, and we're very sad to have started the day with the news from Europe as they are. Having said that, it is my pleasure and distinct honor to invite the Mayor of Charlotte, Jennifer Roberts, to come to the podium. Jennifer?
Well, good afternoon. LJ told me I have 90 seconds. So I want to be sure de souhaiter le bienvenue l'ambassadeur de France, Ambassador Araud. We are so pleased to have you here. On behalf of the city of Charlotte and the 800,000 residents who call Charlotte home, I want to warmly welcome you to a place of real Southern hospitality and also incredible international business opportunities. So we are so pleased. You can tell by the size of the group here today how important the relationship is between Charlotte and France, between North Carolina and France, and between our countries. You know, we have a sister city relationship with Limoges we've had for more than 20 years, and I had the distinct honor of having a daughter who spent 3 weeks in Limoges and who speaks French much better than I do, who is now in college. So we look forward to continuing that exchange. We also, according to the census, we have over 11,000 people in the Charlotte region who claim French heritage, and we have 56 French firms in our region that are employing almost 5,000 people, and some of them are here today, some of those firms. We also have the Alliance Française, one of Charlotte's longest-standing international organizations. Our local chapter was founded in 1949. The French-American Chamber of Commerce has been working many years to promote trade and investment. And there's also l'École du Samedi, which is a French school of Charlotte that helps to create a French-speaking cultural environment dedicated to families and children. And that supplements what goes on in our classrooms and our schools. We also have un programme d'immersion de langue de France, a French immersion program at Waddell Academy, which is a public school here in Charlotte. So we have many, many ties to France. We are honored by your presence. We are honored to have so many people here interested in continuing to grow this relationship. We share in the sadness of Europe for the events in Brussels, and we also know that France has had the terrorism hit its borders as well. One more sign of how important it is for allies in the world to share information, to share relationships, to share the message of peace, but also to work together toward shared international security. So we look forward to your words. We look forward to continuing our relationship. And on behalf of Charlotte, j'ai un petit cadeau pour l'ambassadeur. If you want to step up.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was a gift, in case you didn't understand. together. Thank you very much. Thank you, LJ.
Thank you, Jennifer, the mayor of the city of Charlotte. It is my pleasure to invite to the podium Thomas G. French, President and CEO, Arriva Federal Services, the sponsor of this event today. Thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. As Lubomir just mentioned, my name is Tom Franch, President and CEO of Arriva Federal Services. As a presenting sponsor for today's World Affairs Council Ambassador Series, it is with great honor to welcome Ambassador Gérard Araud to Charlotte. We're indeed privileged to sponsor this event as one of Charlotte's largest French-owned businesses. We recognize our commitment to be a good corporate citizen throughout North America, where our 4,100 employees live and serve, and we are especially proud that we call Charlotte the North American headquarters for Arriva. As a global nuclear energy leader, due in large part to the French international commitment to clean energy, especially nuclear generation, we are a prominent and strong supporter of the U.S. nuclear energy industry, having serviced every single nuclear power plant in the United States. It's no small feat, but one that reflects our commitment to the U.S. energy industry. Naturally, we're delighted to host Ambassador Araud's visit to Charlotte. Although, as you will hear shortly from the Honorary French Consul, Laura Meyer-Wellman, he is no stranger to the United States, having lived here since 2009. So rather than welcome you to Charlotte, Mr. Ambassador, let me just say we are delighted to have enticed you to this part of the United States for a taste of our Southern hospitality. Additionally, please consider that we consider all our Arriva U.S. citizens as ambassadors for France. As we remain committed to clean nuclear energy, demonstrating our resolve in being a good exemplary environmental steward, please feel free to count on us to help you strengthen and promote a strong French-U.S. relationship. Without any further ado, it is my distinct privilege to welcome and introduce the Honorary French Consul, Laura Meyer-Wellman.
It is a distinct honor for us to have the Ambassador of France visiting us. As was pointed out earlier, what a challenging time to be having the ambassador with us, and yet, from his bio and from his experience, you will know that there is no better person to be representing France in the United States than Ambassador Araud. He's a career diplomat. He is a specialist in the Middle East and security issues. He served as ambassador to Israel. He was most recently, prior to assuming his role in 2014, the ambassador to the Permanent Mission of the United Nations. He was on point for the Iran nuclear negotiations from 2006 to 2009. And his knowledge and depth of knowledge about not just his country, not just our country, but the world is absolutely extraordinary. He somehow finds time to be a historian and a writer and an aficionado of the arts and someone who pays attention to the combination of economics, politics, and culture. He prefers Bordeaux to Beaujolais, but only the red, and then it is a white Burgundy over others. And his knowledge of our city, we hope, has grown immensely over this past day and a half that he is spending with us. From his time on Charlotte Talks this morning, where I ask you to please tune in or check it out at 9 p.m. tonight, or however you can get access to it. An absolutely fabulous interview with Mike Collins this morning. Would that we all could be as adept as Ambassador Araud. He is cool, provocative, smart, and caring. And he brings the sense of French humanity to his work here in the United States. It is my great honor today to introduce l'ambassadeur de la République de la France aux États-Unis, Ambassador Gérard Araud.
It's always a bit embarrassing, you know, to listen to this sort of compliments about myself here. You know, Madame le Maire, you know, dear friends, dignitaries, ladies and gentlemen. First, of course, I want to say thank you for the World Affairs Council for this invitation. Thank you for all the citizens of Charlotte for the way they are welcoming me. I think it's, I do understand now what means Southern hospitality. So thank you very much. I will try to be brief, which coming from an ambassador means nothing. You know, really, usually when an ambassador says, I'm going to be brief, it's 30 minutes of platitudes which are coming. So I try to reduce the level of the platitudes by being brief, so I will offer you the opportunity to ask questions on any topic, because I'm going to, you know, to cope with two issues. One which won't surprise you, which will be about terrorism. The other one, the first one, which will be maybe more surprising for you, which will be about diplomacy. The fact is that for a diplomat, it's very difficult to speak to the citizens because when we are speaking about foreign affairs, we are basically coming from two different spots. When you are a citizen and when you are looking at a conflict, basically your natural reaction is to say A is right and B is wrong. So if A is right and B is wrong, we should support A, we should take the side of A, and if we don't do it, it means that we are either stupid or cynical. The problem, I do understand that for a citizen, it's the appropriate way of looking at the real world. Unfortunately, it has nothing to do with foreign affairs. Because usually when you have a conflict, not usually, always, when you have a conflict, the two sides are convinced to be right. So to try to be right, that's the first element. So it's not the good against the bad, it's simply two sides which believe they are right, who are fighting each other. The second point that even if you want to say A is right, B is wrong, it's totally useless because in the world you don't have a court, you don't have gendarmes, policemen who are going to arrest the bad side. You know, the world actually is a jungle of states, and these states are not submitted to any higher authority. So once you have said A is right, and you are coming back home, you feel relieved, but frankly, it was totally irrelevant. So if you want to understand diplomacy, if you want to understand foreign affairs, the first thing that you have to do is to get rid of this idea of saying who is right, who is wrong. Again, the two sides believe they are right. I give you an example. You know, Russia, as you may know, has occupied Crimea, and which is a gross violation of the international law. But it's much more, rather than saying, well, it's bad, it's much more useful to try to understand why they did it. And why they did it, it's not because they are bad and we are good. You know, really, the fact is that 85% of the Russians are supporting President Putin. So they are not stupid. Even if there is propaganda on the Russian media, you know, they have access to internet. It's simply, the fact is that you have a public opinion which is massively supporting what President Putin did in Crimea. Why? That's, you know, I think that's the way, you know, why? Always ask this question. And why, you know, if you meet any Russian, a liberal Russian or a radical Russian, he will tell you that he will not, no Russian will consider Ukraine as a foreign country. It doesn't mean that they are right. You know, again, forget this idea of right or wrong. It's a fact that for the Russians, Ukraine is something special. And from there, from this point of view, you can actually guess what will be the policy of Russia. Russia will not accept that Ukraine becomes part of a group of which Russia is not. Again, I don't approve Russia, but I try to forecast what will be the policy of Russia. And that's what we should do on any conflict, trying to understand the other side. Very often, I said, using a French expression, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the other side, and not considering the other side as bad, but simply having its own logic. It will be useful to do it because it will allow you to forecast what is going to happen. For instance, in Ukraine, since the Russians consider that Ukraine is part of their life, it's part of their history, and actually Ukraine has been Russian for 3 centuries, it means that the Russians are ready to go very far, actually very far, to keep Russia under their influence. You can say it's bad because Ukraine is an independent country, which is the case, but considering that the Russians are ready to go very far, it means that if you want to prevent them to keep their influence on Ukraine, you have to be ready to go as far as they go. And that's the question. Are you ready to die for Ukraine? That's the question. You have to, if you try to have a policy, you have always to be ready to the next step. Okay, if the Russians send soldiers to Ukraine, are you ready to send your soldiers? So you have to adjust to the reality. You have to adjust to the fact that either you are ready to send your soldiers to Ukraine or you are not ready to send your soldiers to Ukraine. And if you are not ready to send your soldiers to Ukraine, you have to draw some consequences of the policy, of the relationship that you are going to have with Russia and with Ukraine. So you see, it's not cynicism, it's simply the real world. Really, and as you know, your country is very prone to see the world in terms of good and bad. And usually you are the good one, and the other side is the bad one. But I guess that it will be the same thing in my country. And unfortunately, I do think that this vision of the world is preventing us, because not only the Americans, the Western world, is preventing us from seeing the world as it is. Because once you have guessed what are the objectives of the other side, when you have guessed, what price is ready to pay the other side to reach this objective, you can also look at yourself and saying, what are my objectives and how I'm ready to pay, how much I'm ready to pay to reach these objectives. And on this basis, you can try to have a compromise, really based on this analysis. So try to be analytical. Really, I know that it's very complicated. I know that we all have guts, and that its guts are telling us to take side and to take side with countries which are our friends or not our friends. But I do believe that if you want to understand foreign affairs, if you want to forecast what is going to happen, you have to have this analytical approach. That was my first point. The second point, which is more, I guess, unfortunately, more expected, is to speak about the issue of terrorism that we are facing, the Europeans being on the front line, but you are facing also, in a sense, less than we are doing because of your geography, but you have also, as we have seen in San Bernardino on December 2nd, you are also facing the same threat in a much less acute way that we are doing, but you are facing this threat. What it is, from where does it come? Actually, the crisis is fueled, I guess, by two phenomena. The first one is very simply the collapse of the Middle East, and especially the collapse of the civil war in Syria and the collapse in Iraq. Since the Middle East had a sort of balance before 2003, a geopolitical balance. Basically, you had Iran, and balancing Iran, you had Iraq, And behind Iraq, you had Egypt and the other Sunni countries. In 2003, somebody totally ignorant of geopolitics decided to destroy Iraq, to invade Iraq, and to destroy Iraq as a geopolitical element of the Middle East balance. It's certainly one of the worst geopolitical blunders in the history of mankind. And the result is there. The Middle East has been totally destabilized. Iraq is a non-functioning state. Iraq now is a non-functioning state. And it has allowed, of course, it has allowed Iran, to move forward, to extend its influence in the Middle East. So you had Iraq exploded. On the top of that, you had what is called the Arab Spring, which is the fact that Syria now has plunged into a civil war. The Syrians, in a very peaceful way, were asking for political rights in 2011, and the reaction of the Syrian regime has been the usual reaction of this brutal dictatorship. They simply shot at the demonstrators, and as could be expected, really after a few months of peaceful demonstrations and brutal repression, the demonstrations have become a civil war. So Syria has collapsed into a civil war. And as usual in the civil war, in the beginning in the civil war, you have the moderates who are on the front line, but moderates are never good fighters. And we have seen the radicalization, little by little, radicalization of the rebels against the government. In 2011, the Russians were telling us, we don't like particularly Assad, but between Assad and the jihadists, we prefer Assad. At the time, frankly, it didn't make sense because the choice was not between Assad and the jihadists. The problem is that right now, maybe that the Russians are right. Really there is the question which is really on the table, whether the choice is not between Assad and the jihadists. So we have a country which basically where the government is controlling only half of the population, really. 24 million of Syrians, 6 million have left the country. 6 million have left the country. 12 million have been displaced. Half of the population has been displaced. So you have the government controlling 12 million of Syrians, and you have the rest of the countries, which now is a sort of huge no man's land, held by not dozens, but by hundreds of groups, really, and most of them are linked to jihadism. From the collapse of Iraq, from the civil war in Syria, we have seen appearing now what we call ISIS or Daesh or the Islamic Caliphate, which is only one of the terrorist groups which are taking advantage of the collapse of Iraq and Syria. So that's the first element, the first phenomenon, this no man's land, really this huge no man's land now with jihadists in Syria and in Iraq. On the other side, you have the problem, which is always difficult to handle, which is the problem of the radicalization of some Muslims. We have a problem which is radical Islam. 99.99% of the Muslims are peaceful, it's a fact, but it's also a fact that we have, throughout the Muslim world, we have seen radicalization of a fringe of the population. In Europe, for instance, in France, we have 8% of the population of our country, 5 million of Muslims, but you have a few thousands of them, so less than one-tenth of a percent, who are tempted by radical Islam. They are radicalized either some of them are radicalized in jail, because when you have petty criminals who are going to jail for stealing cars or drug trafficking, they are radicalized in jail because they are overrepresented in the French jails the same way that the minorities are overrepresented in the US jail. So you have the radicalization in jails, or you have the radicalization through internet. And that's a very difficult topic. You know, we had a teenager, 15 years old actually, who basically, of course, nobody knew, who decided that he wanted to kill a Jew. He bought, in Marseille, in the south of France, he bought a knife, because fortunately in our country it's difficult to buy a gun. So he bought a knife and he attacked a Jewish teacher. You know, he injured the Jewish teacher, 15 years old. Nobody knew him, the police didn't know him, his family didn't know that he was on the process of radicalization. And after that, we have seen, we know that he has really worked on the radical websites for hours and hours, and it was the self-radicalization, which in a sense is less dangerous, but politically very inflammable, because it means that for some people saying, oh, you know, any Muslim can become a problem. So politically, it's very sensitive. The other side is that these radicalized youth are going to Syria. And here we see the meeting of the two phenomena I was referring. We have, as for the French, we have identified, and the word identified is important, we have identified 1,900 French who are going to Syria, or in Syria, or back from Syria. We do consider already that 200 French have been killed in Syria. And these people, you know, I'm speaking of 1,900 French, it means thousands of Europeans, of young Europeans. For Belgium, it's 600. Considering the population of Belgium, you know, it means a lot of people. And these people are going there, and of course they get a military training, and they are still more radicalized, and they come back. So our challenge is to handle these people. We have been obliged to have a bill voted by the parliament to allow us to arrest them when they come back. Because, you know, basically they are coming back. You know, you can say they have not committed any crime, you know, really, and certainly not on the French territory. So really, so we needed a bill to arrest them. At the same time, we have been obliged also to have a bill to try to prevent the youth from leaving the France. You know, because, you know, when you are over 18 years old, of course, you are free to travel. But so when the families were telling us that their son or their daughter, because the families are very much, we are working with them, that they are worried about their son or about their daughter, now we can prevent them from leaving the territory. So, you know, we have been obliged to have all a system of protection against this phenomenon. We have created, of course, social services for de-radicalization of the youth. So it's all a social and security challenge that we are facing. Again, these guys are coming back. Some of them we have not identified. We didn't know that they were in Syria. And there are networks which allow them to come back to Syria. The Islamic Caliphate has created a laboratory to make false identity card and false passports. And they're using also the migrants, you know, the flow of migrants actually to enter the European territories. And among the terrorists of the Paris attacks of November 13th, there were some of them who came in Europe as refugees. So for us, it's obviously a security challenge, a major security challenge. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised by the Brussels attacks. I'm not surprised. You know, the French Minister of Interior was in Washington last week, and he said that we have foiled 12 attempts in France in 2015. 12. So maybe that's more will come. You know, really, it's an ongoing fight, and it's a long-term fight. Second point, in a sense, I don't want to interfere with domestic affairs of this country, but what I'm saying is that all the Western societies all, you know, are facing the same wave of populism. It's very striking, you know, that well, it's the first time in my life, because I've been posted in the US several times, it's the first time in my life where our political scene are so comparable. Everywhere in Europe, you have the same phenomenon that you are facing now in the Republican primaries. We have all our, really, in our country. And which means that try to imagine tomorrow if you had a major attack on the American territory, or if you had 4 million of migrants crossing the Rio Grande, what would be the reaction in a political sense? When I say 4 millions, it's because it's exactly more or less the number that, in a very generous way, Germany has accepted. Germany has accepted 1 million of migrants in 2015 in a very generous way, and obviously it's first it's a logistical problem, you know, really, and the Germans are obliged to use gymnasium, airports, you know, to process and to welcome the migrants. But it's also a major political challenge, and you have seen that during the local elections in Germany, but you have that everywhere and in Europe, and in a sense, in much more in other countries than it is the case in Germany. So that's also feeding populism. You know, really people saying from the far right, we told you so. We told you so. The migrants are a threat, the Muslims are a threat, and so on. We have to close our borders. We have to build walls. It's everywhere the same. So you have also to analyze the terrorist threat, the migration problem, also as a domestic political problem. In a sense, it's a blessing for the far right, what is really happening right now. In a context where you have a lot of people, a lot of Europeans who don't trust the traditional political parties anymore, who consider that the elites are cut from the concerns of the men in the street, and so on and so on. You know, exactly the same problems that you are facing here. So we are engaged in a long-term fight against terrorism, and again, as usual, in a sense, we are side by side with the United States. We, the Europeans, we are sharing not only the same values but the same interest that you are sharing. You are, in a sense, protected by the Atlantic Ocean. You know, really, for the moment, according to what I'm told, if there are 1,900 French there are something like 150 Americans who are going to Syria, in Syria, or back from Syria. Well, the figures are very significantly different. And also, it's much more complicated to enter your country, you know, than it is to enter France or Belgium or Italy or Germany. So we are fighting in Africa, where the French have deployed 4,000 soldiers fighting against terrorism in Africa, and we are working with the Americans who are providing us with tactical air support and intelligence support. We are with you in Syria and Iraq. We were the first one to join the strikes. So we have deployed air means there. Actually, we had an aircraft carrier in the Gulf, and which was the commanding, actually, in charge of all the Navy forces of the coalition in the Gulf. So we have an excellent cooperation, and now we are on the process of still improving the exchange of intelligence. Which exchange of intelligence is always a bit difficult, because first, the intelligence people don't share very easily their information, but also because in such cases, intelligence is very often, you know, names of people, and we all have very particular rules of privacy. We have rules of defending the privacy of our citizens, and so it's always complicated, because we are facing the same challenge that you have been facing after 9/11, which is a challenge between civil liberties and security. It's obvious, you know, you did it through the Patriot Act. It's obvious that when you are facing such a challenge, the balance is shifting towards security and, let's say, at the expense of civil liberties. And we are democratic societies, so there are resistance, there are real political debate in our society. For instance, we have been arguing, the French, we want to have a PNR. PNR is a passenger name record for the flights, you know, really a European one, because we do believe it's important to be able to follow the people when they are flying, you know, when they are flying. And the European Parliament, you know, has been refusing to adopt a European PNR now for several years. So we have a French PNR, but it's less effective than a European one. So there is a debate about civil liberties in our societies. Also in France, you know, we have a state of emergency, which is limiting some civil liberties for 3 months. And of course, our NGOs are protesting. So that's the normal democratic life. And we have to find a good way of sharing our intelligence with other countries, including the Americans, you know, on the basis of of the laws, on basis of the respect of civil liberty. So that's tough. You know, there will be other attacks in the coming months, in the coming years. But we have to trust the strength and the resilience of our societies and of our democracies. We have to destroy, to eradicate the Islamic Caliphate, ISIS, in Syria and Iraq. And actually, the military operation which has been going on has started to have results. The ISIS is really retreating. And we see it also because there are more people coming back to Europe than there are people leaving to Syria. It means that under the pressure, some of the Europeans really want to go back home, which in the short term is increasing the threat in Europe. But I think it's a good signal that things are worsening on the ground for them. And the second one, of course, is to work with our Muslim citizens, Muslim communities, Muslim authorities, to work with them, first to protect them, because it's unavoidable that this crisis is creating also Islamophobic incidents. And we have had, like in the US, we have had this sort of incidents, and we have to fight them. But we need also their help, their support to try to fight the radicalization, because they know, in a sense, they're able to define the message. What should we say to this youth? How to handle the situation, you know, how to handle their aspiration, their religious aspiration in the framework of a liberal democracy. So we need imagination, we need to work together, and we'll win. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for coming to Charlotte. On behalf of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte, I want to thank you for accepting our invitation and coming to speak with us today. And as is our custom at these events, we take a few moments to do Q&A from the audience. So if you have some questions, we have 2 microphones that we will put out here in the audience. And I'm going to start off, though, with the Q&A by invoking my moderator privilege, if you will. Recently, Europe signed an agreement with Turkey to help mitigate and hopefully resolve the immigrant problem, refugee problem. Could you kind of comment your view on this agreement and what your expectations are that this will do for Europe?
One of the consequences of the Syrian crisis, as I have said, it's 6 million of Syrians have left their country. They are living in dismal conditions in refugee camps, and I think it's normal that they are trying to have a better life, and they are coming to the closest place where they hope to have a better life, which is Europe. And as I've said, we have had more than 1 million of migrants last year. And right now, every day, there are 2,000 refugees arriving in Greece, on the shores of Greece. 2,000 a day. The Greeks, of course, are totally overwhelmed. And we can expect that actually when the weather improves, we could be back to figures like 8,000 a day. We have been really able to handle this issue last year, largely through the generosity of Germany and Sweden, which have been the two countries, really taking the largest number of refugees. But it's obvious that it's not possible to do it a second year, really, and politically it's becoming, frankly, unbearable. So what we have tried to find a solution, which is not a perfect one, of course, by working with Turkey, because most of the migrants are coming through Turkey. And we have to recognize that Turkey has really greeted millions of refugees, which is a very heavy burden. So the European Union is going to help Turkey to handle this issue, and it will be $6 billion, really financed by the European Union, so to help the Turks to face this problem. The Turks, on their side, are going to try to cut, really to stop the flow of immigrants, the flow of migrants towards Europe. And for the moment, the solution which has been adopted is to send back the refugees to Turkey so that we can process them afterwards. Really, so we send back 100 migrants to Turkey, but 100 migrants will come back to Europe, but they will be processed in a civilized manner. So we are trying to manage a very strange, very acute, very unexpected phenomenon, which, by the way, which is especially worrying because it's going beyond the Syrian crisis. Because when you have 100 migrants, only 50 of them are coming from Syria. The other ones are coming from Iraq, from Afghanistan. So it may mean that actually in the future, considering our geography, Europe, that we could face such migration, such mass migrations. Try to imagine, for instance, in Africa, in the south of Sahara Desert, you have small countries which are very poor and which are actually the first victims of the climate change through the desertification. And these people, their population is doubling every 18 years. Every 18 years, their population is doubling, and their resources are dwindling. So it's one of the problems that certainly Europe will have to face in the coming decades.
You spoke about current conditions and the past, but the countries of the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, were all Anglo-American creations that were fundamentally unstable.
It's a French creation.
Oh yes. Well, I don't want to overlook your contribution to the instability, but I would say, are those countries going to be reconstituted, or is a new map of the Middle East going to emerge, which would be, in fact, more stable than the countries that now exist?
There is one of the less glorious aspects of the Franco-British history is that in 1917, during the war, 1916, during the First World War, you had two gentlemen, Mr. Sykes, the British one, and Mr. Georges-Picot was the French one, who took a map of the Ottoman Empire, and with a pen, they shared. Really, they shared. So the French, we got what is now Lebanon and Syria, and the British got a bigger slice, really. And we have the map, with the pen. It was the time, the happy times where the French could do that in the world. Really, so it's not very glorious. So we have created we have created Lebanon and Syria, and the British have created Iraq, Jordan, really. But that's one of the questions that a lot of people are raising, saying, what is the future of these countries? What is the future of these borders? Considering that actually a lot of population have been moved, and so maybe again, maybe we have to define countries in the Middle East on the basis of their ethnicity and religion, and to forget these artificial borders. The problem that I see there is if you start by doing that, you'll raise the issue of Kurdistan. You'll raise the issue of creating a Kurdish state. And raising the issue of a Kurdish state, you are really touching a basic nerve of Turkey. You know, because basically 20% of the Turkish territory is populated by Kurdish population. So that would be, it means that the Kurds will say, okay, so we want to be independent, and that's totally unacceptable for Turkey. And it could be also a threat for other countries in this part of the world. And so, and on which basis are you going to define the borders? So maybe, actually, for instance, if you look at Syria, maybe that in fact, you will have 2 or 3 Syria. You will have the Syria controlled by the government, what people call the useful Syria, the Syrie utile. You know, really the way, which is the Syria controlled by the Assad government, and maybe you should have other territories under other controls, and we will try to ensure that these people are not fighting each other. But it's different, you know, from proclaiming, you know, really that's new borders. It's much different, at least for the diplomat, that simply admitting that in fact it's the case, than to decide, you know, politically that we are touching the borders, because it could become extremely dangerous. You don't know where you stop, because, you know, contrary to what the people think, most of the borders are artificial. You know, really look at the border between Canada and the US. They have no basis, you know, it's a line. So all the borders are artificial. So it's better not to touch the borders, you know, really. We have tried to do it in Europe, and it has led to 2 world wars.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. We are students from Charlotte School of Law, and we are currently taking a Homeland Security and Domestic Preparedness class. And my question to you, as a tourist that will be visiting France this summer, what can you tell us about the security measures that France will be taking to ensure the safety of tourists that will be coming this summer, which is primarily the greatest months of your tourists during the year?
Actually, France is the first touristic destination in the world. We are receiving 86 million of tourists every year, and unfortunately 60 million of them are going only to Paris. So I advise you to go out of Paris, because the waiters in the restaurants are much nicer out of Paris. I'm not sure it's a compliment, by the way. And the life is much cheaper. So first, use our great railways, our great infrastructures, and visit the rest of the country. It's obvious that we have dramatically increased the security in our country. One example, these terrorists, when coming back from Syria, are rabidly anti-Semitic. And as you know, one of the 2 attacks in January, one was against journalists and the other one was against a kosher grocery store. So we have increased the security of all the Jewish organizations, Jewish synagogues, Jewish schools, and we have deployed the army. Actually, we have deployed 10,000 soldiers on the French territory to protect these sites. But not only these sites. If you take the French metro, the Paris metro, sorry, you go to railway stations, to airports, you'll see soldiers deployed there. And we have been taking, you know, the level of alert in France has been really, it's at its highest levels. So everywhere you'll go, you'll feel that we are really, we are ensuring the security of the people. At the same time, we can't ensure 100% security. It's obvious, you know, really. But I think we are making a really huge effort. As I have said, we have on our own created our own passenger name record. We are really we have been taking measures which in a sense are comparable to what you have done after 9/11 in terms of cooperation between our intelligence services. It's always, as you know, it's always a surprise to discover that your own intelligence services are not working together very, very well. It was the case, you discovered that after 9/11 also on our side. So we are fully mobilized.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. As a representative of Arriva, I would love to hear some of your perspectives with respect to two things. The first, the most recent Iran nuclear deal, and how you see that shaping the energy mix in the future. And second, you've been in the United States now for several years, and you've looked at the way our country is handling the nuclear energy challenge that we're facing in light of our economy and our energy demands. Could you talk about that as well? Thank you.
On the Iranian nuclear deal, you know, it happens that in this negotiation, we were the tough guys. The French, we were really the hoax. Because we wanted to have a very strong agreement. We were convinced, and we are still convinced that Iran wanted to get a nuclear weapon, that the Iranian nuclear program didn't have any sense if it was not for getting a nuclear weapon. So we don't have any doubt about it. So that's the reason why we have been in favor of strong sanctions against Iran, and strong sanctions had been voted by the European Union, by the US Congress. I want to remind our American friends that actually these sanctions cost the Europeans a lot. Because for the Americans, you didn't have any trade relationship with Iran since 1979, while we had. So the sanctions actually have hurt the Europeans. We have paid a lot for these sanctions. You know, really, for instance, there was a French car maker which was providing 30% of the cars in Iran. You know, really, so it was quite, for this car maker, it was quite a sacrifice, you know, really not to have any activity anymore in Iran. So the sanctions were effective, and I'm personally convinced that if the Iranians came to the negotiation table, it was because the sanctions were hurting. At some moment, the regime has made a calculation between the cost of the nuclear program, you know, and what they wanted to get, and they have concluded that they needed actually to get the lifting of the sanctions. Of course, like in any good negotiation, they have tried to not to pay too much for getting the lifting of the sanctions. That's normal. That's the negotiation. So there was a long negotiation. It was a very technical one, very technical. You know, really, again, I've been the French negotiator between 6 and 9, so I know very well this issue, and it's incredibly complicated, you know, really to look at all the ways your interlocutor can really can avoid the controls or the monitoring that you want to set in place. So it's really, so the result of the negotiation, 159 pages, an agreement of 159 pages, I think that globally it's a good agreement. We have the means through this agreement to monitor very carefully to monitor what the Iranians are doing. And so far, the Iranians have been implementing the agreement. We don't have any doubt. We have the means to control what they are doing. And again, we have also the means to reimpose the sanctions if we want. And the Russians and the Chinese can't prevent us from doing it. We have a system where the vote is by the majority of 5 out of 8, and the Western countries, we have the 5 votes. So we can reimpose the sanctions, and the Russians and the Chinese can't oppose it, even if they want. So we can come back to the situation we had before the agreement. This agreement, you have also to consider, you know, in diplomacy, in foreign affairs, it's like in a normal life. The solution is never a perfect solution. You know, really, we are living in a gray world. You know, really, basically, you are always taking decision in your life. You know it. You know, any decision has some shortcomings. Really, so the agreement is not perfect. But you have also to consider what is the alternative. And I'm really sorry, but the alternative would have been, after 1, 2, or 3 years, the military intervention. You know, because basically, if you don't have an agreement, the Iranians were building more and more ultra-centrifuges, and they were getting closer and closer to a military capability, to the point that sooner or later, the question of military intervention would have been on the table. So considering all these elements, and again, I'm not saying that this agreement is perfect. I'm not saying that this agreement, I would have written this agreement as it is, because it's the result of a negotiation. I do believe that this agreement, it's a good compromise, which is giving us the necessary guarantees that Iran is not going to get the nuclear weapons. I would have preferred that Iranians wouldn't have any enrichment capability on their territory, but we knew from the beginning. You know, we knew from the, you know, we have been negotiating for 12 years. We knew from the beginning that there will be some enrichment capability, really, but to save their face, you know, really. So there is a minimum enrichment capability. So that's, in a sense, the first. As for nuclear energy, you know, really, as you know, France is a major nuclear power, a civilian nuclear power. We are, I think, 70% or more than 70% of our electricity is from nuclear origin. And we are building right now, actually, nuclear power plants, you know, in Finland, in France, and we have a great project to build two of them in Britain. You know, we have just signed a memorandum of understanding to build 2 major power plants in Britain. So we have the competence, we have the commitments towards nuclear energy. And to be frank, I think it's for the last 20 years, at every presidential election in the US, we have been dreaming, saying, oh, this time they are going to come back to nuclear energy in America. You know, really, so whatever were our feelings with the George W. Bush administration, when he was elected, we said, oh, this time there will be back to nuclear energy, you know. The fact is, to be frank, but that's only French assessment, that I really, especially with considering the price of oil, considering the shale gas in resources in this country, that unfortunately I wouldn't bet on the building of a new power plant, a nuclear power plant in this country. Well, that's a fact. It doesn't prevent us from having cooperation with the Americans. For instance, there are cooperation in the field of storage. You maybe not know, but you know, you are in an incredible situation in this country because you have in swimming pools, by your power plants, you have 75,000 tons of waste, of nuclear waste, and you don't have any storage capability. So it's really, frankly, it's for us, it would be a bit scary. So I encourage you, you know, really to think of storage capability, and we have some storage capability, very cheap, $20 billion, according to what I heard. You know, when you speak, the problem is when you speak of nuclear energy, it's always 10 years and nothing less than $10 billion. Areva, I'm sure that Areva has something less than 10 billion, you know, really, if you could be a special rebate, I guess. But, you know, we can work on, seriously, we can work together on storage. We are working on retreatment of military plutonium, you know, because you have military plutonium since you are decreasing, you know, really the size of your nuclear arsenal. And the Americans don't have the technology of nuclear retreatment, so you are working with Areva, actually. So there are a lot of fields where we can work together. You know, we have a site in France where we are exploring actually the storage, you know, really the storage of nuclear waste. And in December, we had staffers from the US Congress who came to France and who visited this laboratory in Bure, you know, really in the north of France, you know, because we have in, I think, 3,000 feet under, we have a laboratory which has been working on this question of storage. So there are a lot of issues where we can work together. It's very striking. When I go to the Congress, it's always one of the issues that my interlocutors, senators or representatives are raising, you know, the nuclear issue. So let's work together.
I would like to thank you for your very powerful and inspiring speech on diplomacy and on the importance of analyzing a situation before taking sides. I think that's that's probably a French positioning that is really inspiring.
And your question?
Two questions. Can I do two?
Please, one. We're running out of time.
Okay. On March 15th, 2015, that is 3 months after the first attacks at the Charlie Hebdo, the Secretary of Education met all over Europe to draft a declaration in Paris. And in this declaration, the idea was to give education a really important place. Where do you stand there? To what extent do you think education is a means to fight radicalization?
Actually, you know, as I've said, the question of radicalization of the young people is immediately raising the issue of education. I think it's a very relevant question. It's not very easy. You know, we have had in the French schools, we have had now for several years, we had courses on the Holocaust. Courses we were teaching the students, the pupils, about the Jewish genocide. And actually, with some of our Muslim students, we had problems because basically they were saying, oh, stop it. What the Germans did to the Jews are doing it to the Palestinians. So we have to reinforce the education, and we have really, especially on racism and anti-Semitism, because it's obvious that in this population, in France, the level of anti-Semitism is totally comparable as a whole to the one in the UK and in Germany, which is very low. But in this population, it's not the case. So we have to work on this issue, which is, as I've said, it's not easy. We have been trying to do for 10 years, and we have to find the right way of doing it. And again, I'm back to the question of messaging, how to have the right message towards this young population. So we are trying to introduce also courses about the values of what we call in French of the Republic, which means the democratic values. Really courses about the women, the place of the women in the society. So it's all anew for us. It's all a new challenge, how to speak to these people to make them understand our values. We have also the problem in terms of the Muslim clergy, because, you know, we don't have enough imams trained in our values. And we are a secular country the same way, different but also the same way that you are, which means that the state can't spend money on training imams. So we have to find ways, trying, you know, really to have imams who are admitted, accepted by the Muslim community, but who know what it means to live in a Western liberal society. So it's a long-term effort. You know, integrating immigrants has never been easy, or has never been a short, really a quick fix. You know, in this country, people forget the way the Italians were greeted in the 19th century, the way the Irish were greeted, you know, in the 19th century. You know, the people forget that also here, suddenly people said, we are Anglo-Saxon Protestant, it's impossible to accept these Italian Catholics. They will never become real citizens. You know, it's always the same, you know, really. So it takes several generations. You know, I always remind you that in 1893, I guess, Roman Catholic nuns were lynched in Boston. You know, really, because they were Roman Catholic nuns. So again, there are tensions. Our societies, the European societies, have the problem of integrating the Muslims. But actually, when you look at the figures, you will be surprised how comparable are the behavior of the Muslim French and the French. Actually, in terms of the rate of birth, for instance. You know, of course, they were making a lot of babies, but right now, their rate of birth is very comparable. They don't go to the mosque more than the French go to church, which is very little. You know, we are not a religious country. So it's coming. It will take decades, and it will be what will be the most effective way of integrating our immigrants will be the same way than it is in this country, through jobs. That's through jobs that you integrate immigrants. And the fact is that my country has had a high rate of unemployment for the last 10 years. And high rate of unemployment, 10%, means that for the immigrants or the last come, it's more 20%. So I am confident, but again, it will take time. And don't forget the resilience of France. We are the 5th world economy. We have been devastated by 2 world wars. We don't have natural resources, and we are here. So France will be here in 20 years. France will be in 100 years. Mon pays est éternel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And I'd like to now introduce Mr. Wayne Cooper, current chairman of the World Affairs Council of Charlotte.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And incidentally, I heard you on the WFAE this morning, and what a refreshing tone from an ambassador that was the best program. As Laura mentioned, it's going to be rebroadcast at 9 o'clock tonight, and tremendous thing. On behalf of that, Bob and I want on behalf of the board of directors like to present this to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, here we go. Bob, get in here.
Quick rip and grin.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
And before we leave, Mr. Ambassador, we've got to recognize somebody that has been the face of France for so many years. Not only was she the past chairman of this organization twice, but also served as France's first honorary consul. And Millie, thank you so much for all that you have done.